In the spring of 1864, just outside a town too small for most maps, the Donovan farm sat quiet at the base of Elk Ridge. The house was modest but stern-looking tall, narrow windows like watchful eyes, shutters that never opened, and a front door that never creaked. The property stretched wide, bordered by black pine and a rusted fence line no one dared cross, not because of the Donovans themselves, but because of what people said they believed. 5 of them lived there: Abraham Donovan, his wife Celia, and their 3 children, all pale, all polite, all strangely quiet. The children didn't play in the dirt like other kids, didn't cause scenes in town, and never once attended school. Most folks in Elk Ridge had never heard their voices at all, but they were always clean, always well-fed, and always gone by sundown. Some said the Donovans were godly, the old kind of godly, the kind that bled into superstition. Others said they were scientists, obsessed with bloodlines and purity, and the kind of improvements that didn't sit right with common folks. But no one ever asked them directly. People in Elk Ridge knew better than to press where questions weren't welcome. After all, the last boy who snuck onto the Donovan land to fish the creek never came back. His name was Peter Grover. His parents stopped asking after 3 weeks. Nobody blamed them. The town sheriff, Emery Tate, once went up to the farm to deliver a tax letter in person. He came back 2 hours later, red-faced and sweating, claiming he'd seen nothing unusual, but he also never returned, and handed all future correspondence off to the postboy. When asked what the place was like, he'd only mutter, "Too clean, too quiet." The Donovans rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when they did, it was always the father. Abraham's voice was low and deliberate, as if every word was weighed before release. He thanked the butcher. He nodded at the general store clerk. But he never smiled. Not once. It was Celia people feared more. She walked like a shadow, fast, smooth, and hard to follow. She wore gloves in every season and never let her children out of arm's reach. Once, a passerby saw her pull the youngest boy aside and whisper something in his ear after he coughed in public. He didn't make a sound for weeks after. Behind closed doors, neighbors said the Donovans were something else entirely. They didn't raise their children, they molded them, corrected them. And if a child couldn't be corrected, well, some said they simply disappeared. That spring, the soil behind the house was turned more often than seemed necessary, but no crops ever grew. In Elk Ridge, people noticed things without saying them. They noticed, for instance, that Celia Donovan had been seen swollen with child more times than she had children to show for. Each time, her figure would grow beneath thick wool cloaks, and then, weeks later, return to its narrow stillness as if nothing had ever changed. No bonnets appeared. No baby cries in the distance. No baptisms, no announcements, no tiny shoes drying by the fire. One of the town's older midwives, Edna Platt, was summoned to the farm in late summer. She returned before dusk with her sleeves damp and her hands trembling. When her husband pressed her for details, she only shook her head and whispered, "It ain't right in that house." She passed 3 months later from what the doctor called a stroke, though those closest to her said she hadn't spoken a full sentence since her visit. Others were called to help, but none were invited in. One woman, Martha Keene, was made to wait on the porch for 2 hours while the birthing supposedly took place inside. When Abraham Donovan finally stepped out, he handed her a warm loaf of bread and told her the labor had ended quicker than expected. She never saw a child. Just a faint wail, not of pain, but something else drifting from the cellar as the door swung shut behind him. By the time word made it around town, the Donovans had gone through what locals guessed to be at least 7 pregnancies. But only 3 children were ever seen walking the fields or sitting quiet in the back of the church. And even those 3 looked different. Not just pale, but uniform, as if carved from the same mold. They never looked tired, never cried. Their eyes didn't dart like other children's did. They only stared long, calm, unblinking. The town clerk once attempted to retrieve birth records for the Donovan children. He found none. No filings, no names, no dates. When he asked Abraham about it during a passing encounter, the man's expression didn't change. "Not all life needs to be written down," he said. No graves appeared, no funerals were held, no wet nurses were hired, and no neighbors reported hearing lullabies, laughter, or the sleepless rocking of a newborn in the middle of the night. What they did hear, sometimes, was something softer, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to anything, living a hush like breath drawn in but never let out. It came through the trees on fog-heavy nights, curling between fence posts, like it was looking for a name it had never been given. People stopped asking. In towns like Elk Ridge, silence was the closest thing to safety. The trader's name was Silas Mott, a wiry man with a mule named Thistle, and a habit of remembering everything he wasn't supposed to. He'd come through Elk Ridge every few months, selling spices, tinware, and ribbons, and picking up whatever gossip the town spilled into his open ears. That winter, a blizzard stranded him a half day from shelter, and the only place still lit was the Donovan farm. They didn't usually take guests, but that night, Abraham opened the door before Silas could knock, like he'd been waiting. No words, just a slow nod and a gesture to come in. The fire was lit, supper was already on the table, and the Donovan children sat like statues, eyes lowered, hands folded. Celia moved about the kitchen in silence, not warm, not cold, just careful. Silas ate quickly, sensing he wasn't welcome to linger. But as Abraham rose to fetch a bottle of something strong from the study, the trader caught a glimpse through the half-open door. There, on the desk, sat a thick black ledger. Its leather cover was worn smooth at the edges, but the clasp shone like it had been polished that morning. For a second, Abraham left it open just long enough for Silas to read a handful of entries. Names, dozens of them. Some he recognized from town, others he didn't. And besides certain ones, small red markings, symbols, not letters, a triangle with a slash, a circle with a line through it. One mark repeated over and over, an open eye with a vertical stroke running through the center. Before Silas could make sense of what he saw, Abraham returned and shut the door with quiet finality. That night, Silas slept in the barn, wrapped in furs beside Thistle, but he didn't sleep much. He heard movement in the farmhouse, not footsteps, more like dragging. Then a single sharp knock, as if something inside had tried to leave but thought better of it. At first light, he thanked the Donovans and set off without breakfast. When he reached the general store in Elk Ridge, he said nothing about what he'd seen. Not at first, but a few days later, after the storm passed, he confided in the clerk's wife over a tin of tea. It wasn't a ledger for debts, he said, voice low. It was a record, a choosing, like he was keeping track of which ones stayed. The woman never repeated what she heard, but from that day forward, Silas never returned to the Donovan farm. And when he came through town again the next spring, he traveled the long way around, even if it cost him 2 days' ride and half a dozen customers. Whatever he'd seen in that black book had changed something in him. Whatever was written there wasn't just for counting. It was for remembering and for something much worse. In the fall of 1864, the Donovan farm hosted a rare visitor, a cousin from Helena named Clara May. She was 6 years old, the daughter of Mrs. Donovan's estranged sister, and she arrived with a suitcase, a patchwork doll, and a stutter that tangled itself into every sentence like it didn't want her to be heard. She was supposed to stay only 2 weeks while her mother recovered from illness. Clara May was a soft, gentle child, bright eyes, quick smile, and words that always seemed to chase themselves in circles before they reached the end. "And may I help?" she'd ask, clutching her doll like it could shield her from her own voice. The Donovan children barely spoke to her. At the dinner table, they watched her as if she was speaking in code. Abraham Donovan said little, but when Clara stammered while answering a question about Grace, he stared at her long enough for her to shrink behind her chair. Celia patted her hand but said nothing else that night. On the third evening, Clara May was put to bed in the sewing room. Celia tucked her in, lit the lamp, and placed her doll on the pillow. "You must try harder to speak proper," she whispered, not unkindly. "Your voice, it confuses the house." In the morning, the bed was empty. The window stood open, the curtains fluttering against the cold. Clara's doll was still there, laid neatly where her head had been. There were no footprints in the frost beneath the window, no signs of broken glass or struggle, just silence and that doll, staring. The Donovans told the town Clara had run off. They said she'd wandered into the woods during the night. A search party formed quickly, and men with lanterns and rifles combed the nearby forest for 2 days. Not a single thread of her dress was ever found. When her parents arrived days later, hollow-eyed and frantic, Abraham repeated the story calmly. She must have gotten frightened, poor thing, wandered off before sunrise. Mrs. Donovan cried, but Celia didn't. She simply clutched her shawl tighter and avoided her sister's eyes. Behind the barn, beneath the ash tree, something new had been buried. The dirt was fresh, the grass torn. No one dared ask. The town moved on, as it always did. But in Helena, Clara's mother kept the telegram. She read it every week until her hands trembled too much to hold it. It read, "Clara ran into the woods. We searched. Nothing found. Very sorry. The Donovans." But she knew her daughter. Clara couldn't run far, not without tripping over her own name. And the doll? The one left behind? Years later, it ended up at a church donation drive in Elk Ridge. The label attached said only one word, written in a child's uncertain hand: return. Oh, they were born on a Sunday morning just after first frost. The labor was quiet, like everything else on the Donovan farm. No midwife, no doctor, no help from town. Just Celia and Abraham behind closed doors, a basin of water, and two sets of blankets warming by the stove. Whispers spread quickly once it was known that Mrs. Donovan had birthed twins. "A boy and a girl," said a neighbor who claimed to hear the cries from the road. One loud and strong, the other barely a whimper. By the end of the week, only one of the infants was seen again. The boy, pink-cheeked, swaddled tightly, held with quiet pride by Celia on the porch when the schoolteacher came by with her tithe basket. No one asked what happened to the girl. There was no funeral, no announcement, no black ribbons tied to the gate. When Mrs. Donovan returned to church 2 Sundays later, her hands were folded and still. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Abraham greeted no one. Behind the house, a patch of earth near the tree line had been recently disturbed, just a slight dip in the soil, smoothed over with pine needles and ash. The town didn't press. They had learned not to, and yet something shifted after that week. Neighbors spoke of hearing lullabies hum too low for a single voice. The wind carried them from the barn, sometimes soft and off-key, as if someone were rocking an empty cradle that still remembered how to sway. Children who played near the Donovan fence began to cry at shadows they couldn't explain. "There's someone there," one boy said, pointing toward the tree line. "She wants to come inside." At night, lanterns flickered in the upstairs window, even when the family was seen asleep downstairs. A traveling preacher passing through asked if they'd had 2 children or 1. Celia didn't answer. The boy grew quickly, strong, quiet, obedient, like all the Donovan children before him. But sometimes, when he stared too long at the mirror above the hearth, his mother would gently turn him away. And when he laughed, very rarely, it sounded like someone else laughing too, just a breath behind. They called it the Black Barn. Not because of the paint there was none, but because the wood had darkened over time into a deep, unnatural gray, like it had absorbed more than just weather. It sat crooked at the edge of the Donovan property, half swallowed by wild grass and blackberry brambles, its roof sagging in the middle like it had started to kneel. Children from the Garrison Ranch, 2 miles west, dared each other to get close. They'd ride their bikes as far as the tree line, drop them, and creep through the brush with trembling knees. The rule was simple: get close enough to touch the door, then run. No one had ever actually opened it, until Thomas Garrison, age 10, did. The wind died as he reached the frame. No birds, no flies. Even the grass seemed to hold its breath. The door was heavier than it looked, moaning as it gave way an inch. Inside, the dark smelled like rust and something sour, like milk left out too long. He didn't go in, just leaned his head around the frame. What he heard made his blood ice over. It wasn't a scream, or a moan, or an animal sound. It was crying, soft, muffled, and rhythmic, like someone buried beneath the floor, weeping into the dirt. Not panicked, just tired, like they'd been doing it for a long, long time. Thomas ran so fast he tore the skin off his palms when he tripped over the gravel road. He didn't talk for hours. When he finally did, all he said was, "She's still in there." The other children never got that close again. That night, Mrs. Garrison noticed muddy footprints on her porch that didn't match any of their boots, small, bare, and facing the door. The next day, Mr. Donovan was seen hammering a new lock onto the barn, a rusted iron latch with a chain thick enough for a jail cell. From that day on, the Donovans refused to speak of the building. Celia claimed it hadn't been used in years. Just storage, she said when asked. Old lumber, broken tools. But when storms rolled in, lightning always struck near the barn first. And once, when a dry wind swept through Hollow Bend, neighbors claimed they saw smoke rising from its roof, though there was no fire, only the smell of something scorched. The black barn stayed locked, but the crying never stopped. Dr. Ellis wasn't the kind of man who frightened easily. He'd seen frostbite take fingers clean off, delivered babies in blizzards, and stitched up bullet wounds from backwoods brawls. When the telegram came from the Donovans requesting help for Celia's sudden infection, he packed his satchel without hesitation. It was just a short ride east from town. He was back by nightfall, but he never spoke of what happened in between. He arrived just after noon, the snow melting in soft patches beneath his boots. The Donovan house looked the same as always, too quiet, windows drawn, porch sagging under its own weight. Mr. Donovan met him at the door without a word and led him inside. The parlor smelled like damp wood and something metallic. Not blood exactly, something older, sharper. Upstairs, Mrs. Donovan lay in bed, pale and sweating. A rash bloomed across her side in the shape of something almost floral, too symmetrical, too unnatural. When he asked how long she'd had it, she didn't answer, just stared at him like she was waiting for him to understand something she couldn't say. He examined her in silence, then asked to wash his hands. Mr. Donovan led him to the kitchen, where the doctor noticed a thin trail of dried mud running from the back door to the cellar, a door he swore hadn't been there last time. Then the whispering started. At first he thought it was the wind pushing through cracks in the boards, but the sound had rhythm, pacing. It grew louder when he stepped near the cellar door. Small voices, not quite children, not quite echoes, just not right. He left without finishing the treatment, said Celia needed rest, that the fever would break on its own. He didn't mount his horse until he'd passed the edge of the property. His hands shook as he gripped the reins. And when the sheriff later asked if he planned to follow up on the case, Dr. Ellis stared at the floor for a long time before quietly saying, "That house is not my concern." He never went back. 3 weeks later, someone found his satchel on the outskirts of Hollow Bend. It was torn open, pages from his notebook scattered like leaves. One entry was legible, a single sentence written in heavy ink, over and over again. "She isn't the sick one." Miss Althea Granger was not from Montana. She came from Providence, with a suitcase full of lesson plans and a voice trained to calm rowdy rooms. The town council had hired her to bring structure to the prairie children, to civilize what the East called the unschooled wild. She wore her hair in a tight bun, always smelled faintly of lavender soap, and believed firmly that every child deserved a proper education, even the Donovans. It was a Tuesday when she first walked the 3 miles to their homestead, boots muddy and clipboard in hand. She'd been warned softly, cautiously, that the family kept to themselves, that their children were rarely seen beyond the split-rail fence. But that only deepened her resolve. She believed isolation bred ignorance. She believed in letters and arithmetic and the power of a chalkboard. When she knocked on the door, Mrs. Donovan answered, barefoot, silent. Her dress was stained at the hem, and her eyes didn't blink enough. Miss Granger introduced herself cheerfully, explained that she'd come to register the children, that it was state law. She offered pencils as gifts. Mr. Donovan stepped into the doorway without a word and took the clipboard from her hands. Read it slowly, then handed it back. "No," he said. Miss Granger frowned, thinking perhaps he misunderstood. She began explaining again, slower this time. He cut her off. "You bring your schooling somewhere else," he said. "Ours don't need it." "But it's required," she said. "They have a right to learn." Mrs. Donovan stepped forward then, voice low and flat. "They learn what we give them, nothing else." Miss Granger held her ground, polite, professional, but firm. She asked if she could meet the children. She thought she heard movement behind the curtains upstairs, quick and light, like birds scattering. Mr. Donovan's eyes narrowed. "Come back here again," he said, "and we'll bury your books with you." She didn't return. Instead, she submitted a letter to the council, requesting intervention. But no one followed up. Winter came fast that year, and the schoolhouse roof caved under a heavy snow. Miss Granger packed her things in early December and boarded the last supply wagon heading east. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. But before she left, she gave her landlord a note to deliver to the sheriff. It was written on school paper and folded 3 times. It read, "There are more children inside that house than they claim to have, but not all of them look alive." No one knows if the sheriff ever read it. The note disappeared from his desk before the week was out. Pastor Emery hadn't planned to speak to Mr. Donovan that Sunday. He was a cautious man, known more for his long silences than for his sermons, and he believed most troubles resolved themselves if left untouched. But something in the older children's eyes, especially the boy who stared too long without blinking, unsettled him. The Donovans never took communion. They never stayed to shake hands, and this Sunday, they left before the final hymn. Still, Pastor Emery caught him just outside the chapel, near the edge of the woodpile, where the air still smelled of pine and ash. He placed a hand on Mr. Donovan's shoulder and said, as gently as he could, "I believe we're meant to raise our children in the light, not behind locked doors." Mr. Donovan didn't flinch. He looked at the pastor with something colder than contempt, something practiced. "They're raised," he said, "and they're not yours to worry on." Pastor Emery hesitated, then said, "There are whispers about missing births, about a girl with a stutter who came here and never left. I don't chase gossip, but I protect this flock." Mr. Donovan's jaw tightened. For a moment, Pastor Emery thought he might strike him, but instead, he spoke with calm conviction. "Some lines must remain strong," he said, "and unclouded. That's the only way the blood remembers." The pastor blinked. "What do you mean?" Mr. Donovan took a step forward, voice low and even. "Some families spread thin, marry out, soften, forget who they are, but not us. We've kept to what was given, and it's our right to keep it pure." Pastor Emery felt a sickness rise in his stomach. He'd read sermons about such thinking, dark histories from distant lands, but never here, never in Montana. "That's not God's way," he said. "That's man's fear speaking." Mr. Donovan leaned in, close enough that Emery could smell something sour on his breath, like rotting apples or old milk. "Fear keeps the weak out," he said, "and it keeps the strong in." Then he turned and walked off toward his wagon, his boots leaving no sound on the frozen earth. His children followed behind like shadows, never looking back. That night, the pastor rewrote his sermon. He burned the first draft in the fireplace and slept with the window locked. By morning, his dog had gone missing, and someone had hammered nails into the chapel door. He never brought up the Donovans again, not in church, not to his wife, not even to God. By the first week of December, the mountain pass into Hollow Ridge was buried under 4 feet of snow. The mail wagon stopped running, the church bell froze in place. Most families gathered close and waited out the storm with prayer, soup, and silence. But no one thought much about the Donovans, not at first. They were used to doing things their own way. The family hadn't stepped into town since October. The children didn't come for schooling, and the mother hadn't visited the apothecary since autumn, when she'd purchased tinctures for the cough. Yet smoke still rose from the Donovan chimney every morning, curling into the pale white sky like a signal that said, "We're alive. Stay away." Weeks passed, then a month. No tracks in or out, no letters, no need for the postman to even glance up their way. Still, the smoke came, steady, controlled, never too much, never too little, just enough to say someone was tending the fire. Mr. Harlan, who owned the feed store, swore he saw someone walking the Donovan fields during a late snow squall. Said it wasn't one of the children. Said the shape was too tall, too thin. Like a scarecrow that learned to walk, he mumbled over his whiskey. No one believed him, but no one laughed either. In January, a group of ranch boys tried to ride up the bluff to get a closer look. Their horses wouldn't go near the gate. One bucked so hard it broke its leg, had to be put down on the spot. The boys came back pale and shivering, saying they heard a voice in the trees, not loud, but low, like it was speaking right behind their ears. By February, the town had stopped speaking about the Donovans altogether. It was easier that way. Some truths, even half-formed ones, had no place next to a warm fire or inside a child's bedtime. Then came March. The snow began to melt, and with it came the smell. Faint at first, metallic, bitter, unnatural. It drifted downwind toward the church, clung to the sides of the chapel bell, seeped into the walls of the general store. No one said it aloud, but every stomach knew it. the stench of something once alive, now left too long in the dark. Still, the chimney smoked, every morning, just enough, as if someone inside still believed that so long as the fire burned, the world wouldn't dare knock. The thaw came late that year. It always did in Hollow Ridge, where the wind clung to the pines like it had secrets to keep. But by mid-April, the snow began to loosen its grip, curling away from fence posts and dripping from rooftops like a quiet surrender. Rivers overflowed, mud swallowed wagon wheels, and the Donovan's land, so long hidden under white, began to show its skin again. Caleb Myrick was the first outsider to step near the bluff that spring. A trapper, mostly, spent his winters in the backwoods with no company but snares and scars. He didn't fear the Donovans the way townsfolk did. Said a man who lives off the land doesn't spook easy. Said fear is just a warning shot from something older than words. He didn't plan to stop, but one of his dogs veered off the trail, nose low, tail stiff. Caleb followed, cursing the cold, until he reached the tree line behind the Donovan property. That's when he saw them. 6 mounds, all small, tucked just beyond the orchard, where the soil stayed loose. No stones, no names, just simple earth, barely patted down. Most looked aged, weathered by seasons and snow. But one was different. It was fresh, the dirt still wet and dark, like it had only just been placed. Caleb knelt beside it, removed his gloves. The soil was warm, not from the sun, not from the air, warm like a heartbeat. He didn't touch it again. Later, he'd say the woods were silent, that the birds stopped singing the moment he saw those graves, that even the wind held its breath. He'd say he felt something watching, not angry, not even cruel, just watching, as if measuring his soul. Caleb turned back before reaching the barn, didn't look inside the windows, didn't call out. He walked until his boots bled, and didn't speak a word until he reached town. At the saloon, he asked for a drink, then another. Said he found something behind the Donovan place. Said it wasn't his to understand, but someone should see it before the next snow covered it all again. He never went back. No one did. Not then, not yet. But the whisper spread, a fresh grave behind a house with no children left. And if one was fresh, then who exactly was still digging? By May, the rumors had grown roots. They crept into dinner tables, into pews, into the spaces between sleep and silence. Everyone in Hollow Ridge had heard them. About the graves, about the doctor who never came back, about the girl with the stutter, the teacher who vanished from town without a goodbye, the crying beneath the floorboards. They all connected now, whether folks wanted them to or not. So the council met. 5 men, chosen more for their age than their wisdom, gathered in the back of the old post office. No official record was kept, just whispers between men with tired eyes and too many things they didn't say aloud. Sheriff Mallory wanted nothing to do with it. He said unless there was a warrant or a crime that could be named, the law had no place stirring up shadows. But not all agreed. Pastor Keene pressed his hand flat to the table and said, "There's something unclean on that land, and we have a duty to face it." No one met his eyes. They debated for hours, words like trespass and scripture, like justice and judgment. But none wanted to be the one to walk up that hill, knock on that door, and ask what had become of the children. Then Jonah Rusk stood, old trapper, weathered like dried leather and twice as stubborn. He had buried 2 sons in the war and said he wasn't afraid of burying himself. "If no one else will go," he muttered, "I will." No one stopped him. Maybe because deep down, they wanted someone else to carry it, whatever it was. He left just before dusk, rifle on his back, flask in his coat, said he'd be back by morning with answers or not at all. He never came back. Not the next morning, not the morning after. They found his horse 2 days later, tied to a split-rail fence on the edge of the Donovan property. Saddle intact, reins coiled, but no sign of Jonah. No footprints, no note, just silence, the kind that sinks into your lungs if you stand too long near it. The council never met again. Whatever decision had been made was buried under their fear. And on Sunday, when the congregation gathered, Pastor Keene said only one sentence during his sermon. No scripture, no benediction, just this: some doors don't close once opened. No one spoke of Jonah after that. Not in the open, not even in prayer. He showed up just after dawn, barefoot and bleeding from one heel, clothes torn like he'd crawled through a thicket of wire. The mining camp at Elk Ridge wasn't known for charity, but there was something in the boy's eyes, or rather, in the absence of anything behind them, that made even the hard men stop and lower their voices. He said his name was Elijah Donovan. No one had heard that name in years. He looked about 17, though no one could be sure. Gaunt but tall, with the bone structure of a boy who'd grown without enough food, or sunlight, or kindness. His hands trembled constantly, like they'd forgotten how to rest. And when asked where he came from, he gave no straight answer, only muttered strange phrases that didn't quite fit together. The ledgers burned, but the marks remain. Only the pure were kept. She fed the roots. At first, they thought he might have wandered from some religious cult in the mountains. They had those, out there, quiet places that bred quiet madness. But when an old trader heard the name Donovan, he dropped his coffee tin and backed out of the mess hall like something was on fire. Said he remembered the family from Hollow Ridge, said they were all wrong. The sheriff from Bitter Gap came to question the boy, tried to take a statement. But Elijah just smiled with cracked lips and said, "You can't arrest what doesn't stay buried." When asked about the others, about his siblings, about the farm, he went silent. For hours, then finally whispered, "I wasn't supposed to make it past 5. They found scars on his back, lines too clean to be accidental, almost surgical, crosses, circles. One mark that looked eerily like the symbol etched into the graves found behind the Donovan property, a symbol no one in town had ever been able to identify. They kept him in the infirmary for a week. He didn't try to run, didn't eat much either, just stared out the window and mumbled to someone who wasn't there. On the 7th night, he disappeared. The window was still locked from the inside. All that was left was a single line, carved into the wooden frame with something sharp and steady. Some seeds don't need sunlight. No one's seen him since, and no one in Elk Ridge asks questions anymore. Under a gray, reluctant sky, 5 men rode out toward the Donovan place with rifles in hand and sleeves rolled high. They didn't speak much, just nodded to each other and pressed forward through the wet spring mud, the kind that clings to your boots like guilt. They weren't lawmen, just fathers and brothers who'd heard too much, waited too long, and buried too many questions. When they reached the edge of the Donovan property, the chimney was cold, no smoke in weeks. The front door hung slightly open, swaying with the wind, groaning on its rusted hinge like it remembered too much. But they didn't go in. It was the barn they wanted, the black one, the one no child had ever been allowed near, the one with the padlock that had no key. The youngest of the men, Tomas, who'd once courted a Donovan cousin before she disappeared without a word, kicked the lock clean off with the heel of his boot. Inside, the smell hit them first, not death. Worse, damp rot and old iron, and something chemical that stung the eyes. The walls were lined with tools, none of them clean, none of them farm-made. Hooks, clamps, lengths of chain that served no clear purpose. In the center, beneath a pile of hay that looked too carefully placed, was a trapdoor. It creaked open, like it hadn't been touched in years, but beneath it, fresh earth told a different story. They lowered a lantern first, then themselves one by one into a narrow stairwell that descended deeper than it should have. The pit was maybe 10 feet across, circular and lined with stone. Bones layered it like leaves in autumn. Some snapped clean, others twisted in ways the men couldn't make sense of. None were longer than 2 feet, and at the bottom at the very center was a child's shoe, upright, as if it had been placed there with intention. Tomas fell to his knees and vomited. Another man began to pray, low and broken. One of them swore he heard movement behind the walls, but none of them checked. Not then. They climbed out slow, none meeting each other's eyes. No one spoke on the ride back to town. When they reached the edge of Hollow Ridge, they stopped at the old church, handed the pastor a folded scrap of fabric torn from the barn wall, and said only, "It's not a rumor." That night, the bells didn't ring. The town simply locked their doors, lit their lamps, and prayed the wind wouldn't change. They came for the Donovans just before dusk, when the light fell soft and tired over the valley. No torches, no shouting, just 2 wagons, 6 deputies, and the quiet weight of a town that had finally decided enough was enough. By then, the barn had been sealed with boards and nails. The wind carried rumors faster than truth could keep up, but what they'd found was enough, more than enough. The Donovans didn't run, they didn't hide. When the deputies arrived at the front steps, Mr. Donovan opened the door as if he'd been expecting them. His shirt was buttoned to the neck, hands clean, eyes dull like water left standing too long. Mrs. Donovan sat in her rocking chair with knitting in her lap, though the yarn was tangled and thin. The two remaining children stood behind her, silent, barefoot, faces unreadable. No crying, no protest, just a strange, hollow stillness that clung to the room like dust. Sheriff Galen asked Mr. Donovan to step outside. He did, asked him to place his hands behind his back. He did that too. The cuffs clicked, cold and final, and still he didn't blink, didn't flinch. One of the deputies, younger than the rest, asked the question everyone else had been too afraid to say aloud. Why? Mr. Donovan turned slowly, his voice low but steady, like a man reading scripture in a language only he understood. You wouldn't understand, he said. We were preserving something. The sheriff didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded to the others and ordered the rest of the family into the wagon. As the horses pulled away, a few townsfolk stepped out from their homes, not many, just enough to bear witness. Mothers clutching children, fathers with clenched jaws. No one cheered, no one wept, just watched as the Donovans left the ridge for the last time. That night, someone nailed shut the barn again, even though it was already boarded. The church bell rang once, not for mourning, not for celebration, but as a warning. The wind was still, the air held its breath. And somewhere in town, behind thick curtains and locked doors, a woman whispered to her husband that she'd seen one of the Donovan children smile as they passed. Not scared, not sad, just calm, like they knew something the rest of the town never would. The trial began on a Monday. Rain tapped against the windows of the county courthouse like it wanted in. By noon, every pew in the gallery was filled, locals, out-of-towners, even a few journalists who'd traveled from as far as Chicago, drawn by the whispers. They called it the Donovan case, but most just said them people from the ridge, and left it at that. Mr. Donovan sat calmly at the defense table, his hair combed back, his suit too neat for a man accused of what he was accused of. Mrs. Donovan stared at the floor. Neither of them spoke much, not even to their lawyer. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at the jury. It was the ledger that changed the mood in the room. Up until then, it had all felt like a performance legal procedure, sworn testimony, the slow rhythm of justice. But when the sheriff held up the black book and opened it to the first page, the silence was immediate. Names, dozens, maybe more, some underlined, others crossed out. Strange marks beside many symbols no one could quite explain. Each name belonged to a child, and many of those names had never been seen in public record. No birth certificates, no church entries, nothing. As the prosecution read from the pages, one juror, a middle-aged seamstress from Helena, pressed a hand to her chest and slumped forward. They carried her out. Another juror, a young man barely older than the age of some children in the book, walked out during a medical testimony and never came back. The courtroom doors opened and closed, but no one spoke above a whisper after that. Doctors took the stand. Forensics men from the university tried to describe what was found beneath the barn without showing the photographs. Even so, the language was enough fractures that didn't match falls, patterns that suggested something far worse than accident. One described the spacing of the graves and choked up mid-sentence. He'd seen battlefield mass burials. He said this was neater. The defense tried to argue tradition, claimed the Donovans came from an older way, that their beliefs weren't malice, just misunderstood. But no one bought it, not when the survivors came forward, not when they showed the marks on their backs, not when one boy described, in vivid detail, how some children went below and never came back. The judge asked Mr. Donovan if he had anything to say before the jury was dismissed. He stood, adjusted his cuffs, and said, "Every tree grows best when you prune the weak branches. That's all we ever did." That night, the jury didn't sleep. Most of them never would the same way again. The sentence was handed down at dusk. The judge didn't speak louder than necessary. He didn't need to. Everyone in that packed courthouse already knew what the verdict would be. The gavel fell like a final breath, and the room stayed quiet, not out of respect, but something closer to exhaustion. No cheers, No gasps, just the sound of papers being shuffled and one man in the back quietly weeping into his hat. The Donovans were to hang at sunrise. Both of them, the gallows had been built days earlier, just in case. Some called that arrogance, others called it preparedness. Either way, by the time the sun broke the horizon the next morning, the entire town had gathered. Not just to witness justice, but maybe to see if the couple who'd haunted the edges of their lives for so long were even capable of dying like regular people. Mr. Donovan walked with a straight back. He wore the same black coat he'd worn at the trial, buttoned to the collar, even in the morning heat. His eyes never once left the horizon. Mrs. Donovan came second. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She looked out at the crowd like she was surveying a harvest. The sheriff asked if they had any final words. Mr. Donovan said nothing. But Mrs. Donovan turned, slow and deliberate, and locked eyes with a girl in the crowd, one of the survivors, now holding her own daughter's hand. And she smiled. "At least we kept the line pure," she said. There was a moment after that where it felt like even the birds stopped. The nooses tightened, the lever fell, and that was that, or so everyone hoped. But that same night, long after the bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside town limits, strange things began to happen. Dogs howled without reason. Weather vanes spun in windless air. And in the cellar beneath the courthouse, the black ledger locked in a drawer no one touched was found open. One more name had been added. No one saw who did it, and no one recognized the name. But someone would. Eventually. They weren't supposed to dig that far. The blueprints didn't mention a basement. No records of any underground level, no sign of stairs, nothing. Just old stone foundation and prairie dirt, like you'd expect from a crumbling farmhouse abandoned for over a century. But on the third day of site prep, when the crew hit something hollow beneath the kitchen ruins, everything stopped. It wasn't a root cellar. The walls were too smooth, the corners too exact, sealed from the inside, with timber beams that had blackened but never burned. The air that poured out was cold, unnaturally cold, and smelled like damp cloth and something faintly sweet, like spoiled milk. They broke through around noon. Flashlights were lowered. One of the workers, a father of 3, volunteered to go first. He made it 5 steps down before he came running back up, pale and shaking. He wouldn't say what he saw at first, only that there's something still down there. The foreman assumed it was rats or bones or mold. But when they all finally descended with floodlights and masks, what they found wasn't rot or ruin. In the center of the small stone room sat a wooden cradle, dustless, perfect, as if it had been placed there yesterday. Carved into the headboard, in letters sharp as if cut by a knife that morning, was a single name, THADDEUS. No Donovan child was ever documented with that name, not in any census, not in the trial records, not in the town archives, but the name was there, etched deep into oak. No birth date, no death, just THADDEUS. And then came the sound, quiet at first. A soft, rhythmic creak, like the cradle was rocking. No wind, no hands, no movement visible, just the cradle moving, and from the shadows beyond it, crying. Not loud, not panicked, but steady, infant-like, too soft to record, too real to deny. They fled. The site was shut down within the hour. Equipment left behind, reports filed but never followed up on. One worker quit the next day and moved states. Another started carrying a Bible to every job since. As of now, the property remains untouched, the basement resealed. But on quiet nights, when the wind dies down and the stars hold still, neighbors say they still hear it. The creak of a cradle and a sound beneath it, breathing. Comment what state you're watching this from, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more dark history stories they never told you.